Good evening and welcome to the New York Symposium with Diane Sayre. I'm Diane Sayre. I'm a LaRouche independent candidate for U.S. Senate in 2024, and today is May 6th. We are on the eve of Memorial Day weekend, and I think this is a very important time for us to reflect on lives lost, both in war and otherwise. And that will get at somewhat the topic of this evening's discussion, which is the unbelievable level of violence right now in the United States, where we have a mass shooting, which I think officially, legally is a shooting where 4 people or more are struck now every 16 hours. This is not normal. This has not always been happening. This should not be happening. One of the worst ideas would be for people to think that we have to, quote unquote, adjust or learn to live with something which is frankly not even human and is not really how a civilized society should act. And we're going to hear from 2 speakers this evening who can shed some light on that, which I will get to in a moment. Where we are in the world is somewhat breathtaking. On the one hand, the conflict in Ukraine, which is really a proxy war between the West and Russia, and hopefully will not become soon a proxy war between the West and China, is becoming even more intense, where rather than seeking a negotiation and a way to end the bloodshed, the United States has announced that we'll be sending F-16 fighter jets, but they are really not consequential because it takes so long to train people. The runways have to be built. It's a very specific kind of technology. So in a sense, it's really a joke. And it's a message to the people of Ukraine: you just keep on fighting. We want to bleed Russia, and we're oblivious to your suffering as this occurs. There was a major shift, which is that Bakhmut, which probably will now be known as Artyomovsk, has fallen to Russia, which should lay to rest the idea that if we keep sending more and more weapons, Ukraine is going to, quote unquote, win. If you look at a map, should be obvious that this is not going to have a happy ending, and the wisest thing would be to figure out a means of a negotiated settlement with the interest of saving lives and figuring out a way to bind the wounds of nations which formerly had been very close and brotherly, frankly. And I think Memorial Day was initiated after the Civil War, and I think it's something for Americans to reflect on, what it would be like to be in a war. I have been at meetings where a person said, my daughter is in the Ukrainian army, my son is in the Russian army. Every morning I wake up terrified. That is again also not natural, but there are people with financial interests, other interests, who are pouring funds into this, funding extremist groups, people with frankly Nazi regalia, etc. And the truth will come out eventually if anyone is left alive to ensure that it does, if we don't push this over the brink to something that cannot, to annihilation. We also have a blowout of the financial system, which is really the driver of this, and it's being admitted that there are as many as 2,000 banks in the United States that are insolvent. Now, of course, Wall Street and the City of London are not going to admit that perhaps we should take a page from the work of Franklin Roosevelt, reinstate the Glass-Steagall Act, perhaps go after some of the billionaires who created this mess and save the middle class and the poor. But instead, we are told that everything is fine, and if they just fiddle with the interest rates a little bit more, that somehow we can stop inflation. Well, I don't know how having 7 or 8, are we heading for 8% interest rates on mortgages and loans is going to help us fight inflation, but that's the logic of the economists. Now, otherwise, you have extremely interesting initiatives coming from China, Russia, the work that China did between Saudi Arabia and Iran, who have not been partners, but which has led to a restoration of diplomatic ties and an end to the war in Yemen, an end to the blockade, a potential shift in relations now also between Syria and Saudi Arabia. So just when you are told that war cannot be stopped, these people, we all hear this, they've been killing each other for forever. Well, it's not true. If there is a higher principle introduced, particularly that of economic development, then you might find that actually it is not the natural course of things for people to be in perpetual war, that actually it's universal, that people would like their children to grow up and have a life that perhaps is easier than theirs and have the opportunity to be better educated and become better people. And in the United States, we used to believe that the next generation would have a better life than we do. Now, we are told that we shouldn't have that standard anymore. So with that said, let me say, as always, participation in my symposium does not constitute endorsement of my candidacy. I and my guests may or may not agree on everything, but I am doing this because I think it is urgent that the voters and the citizens are informed on certain matters that are of great import. And I will say that my guests this evening are Megan DeBroat, who is the president in the United States of the Schiller Institute, who is a musician, who is one of the directors of the Schiller Institute Chorus, and who also worked closely with Lyndon LaRouche on science. And my other guest this evening is Pastor Kinzer Pointer, who I came to know through some work on initiatives to deal with the pandemic, whose church and was involved in an incredible outreach to Buffalo. But of course, being a pastor must deal with many things in life, and himself personally knew most, if not all, of the victims of the horrific shooting at the Tops grocery store, which occurred nearly exactly 1 year ago, May 14th, 2022. And he will be sharing with us some of the lessons learned from that and ideas for how to make sure this doesn't happen again. So with that, we're going to hear first from Megan, and then we'll go to Pastor Pointer.
Thanks, Diane. So I want to start with a statistic, which Diane already referenced, but it's actually worse. It's actually worse than you said, Diane. So since January of this year, there have been 242 mass shootings in the United States, killing 4 or more people. Now, if people can count, there have been fewer than 242 days this year. So it actually amounts to one shooting every 14 to 15 hours. It's also the case that since 9/11, for the past 22 years, young people in the US military have been deployed as killers to Southwest Asia in these wars. And a probably very conservative estimate from Brown University states that nearly 1 million people overall, 387,000 of them civilians, have died violent deaths as a result of direct combat operations. And more than that, as of May of this year, 3.6 million people, again, an estimate, have died indirectly in the post-9/11 war zones. What has become of us? What does it mean about our culture, about our society, when our youth, our children, have become mass murderers? And what do we do about it? Now, in 2007, Lyndon LaRouche wrote a paper which is called From Milken and Enron to Perugia, Extreme Events. And in the paper, he takes up 3 interrelated, at that time, recent events. One of them was a terrible school massacre in Finland. Second is a gruesome murder of a British exchange student in Italy. And the third was then Treasury Secretary Hank Paulson's response to the collapse of the financial system, which was to pull out what he called a bazooka of billions of dollars of bailout money to Wall Street. Now, in this paper, Lyndon LaRouche makes the point that all three of these events, while shocking, were absolutely foreseeable as manifestations of a culture of mass insanity, which has gripped the United States increasingly since the death of Kennedy. This is a culture which is based ultimately or essentially on a systemic dehumanization of the image of man. And LaRouche said in another paper earlier from 1999 called Star Wars and Littleton, and he wrote this just a few months after the massacre at Columbine High School. He said, "How does one corrupt innocent children to becoming psychotic-like killers? The quick answer to that question is dehumanize the image of man. The details of the way that this leads to the production of youthful Nintendo terrorists is a more complicated matter. But nonetheless, it is no oversimplification to say that once the first step, dehumanizing the image of man, is accomplished, the axiomatic basis has been established to make war and killing merely a childish game played according to a childish mind's perception of the importance of obeying the rules." Now, in that same writing, LaRouche addresses the reader and says, look, you have to face the fact, we have to face the fact that it's this epistemology, it's the fundamental belief about what a human being is that we as a society have accepted, have condoned, have tolerated, and we've accepted it in the actions of everyone from our elected political leaders who kill with the stroke of a pen in their policies, to the absolute gutting out of the US economy in favor of get-rich schemes on Wall Street, to the policies of our military and other leaders in their perpetual war policy. So is it surprising then, from that standpoint, that today our youth have turned into deranged mass murderers? Obviously not all of them, but this is absolutely an epidemic. Now, in May of 2000, Lyndon LaRouche founded the Commission Against the New Violence. And at that founding meeting, he said, "Let me begin by making a few observations. Let me observe what we may call the specificity of the new violence." Now, by new violence, we mean, by first approximation, the Nintendo killers in the military. We mean the replacement of qualified police officers by Nintendo cops. We mean Nintendo kids in the schools. This is where the core of the new violence is located. It's not in the bullet, it's not in the axe, it's not in the hammer, it's not in the fist. It's not, the violence is not located in the physical act performed upon the victim. The new violence is located in the peculiarly perverted minds of the perpetrators. The perpetrators are typically military professionals trained by the official military or trained by programs designed originally for the military. And he goes on, and then he comes to the question of children, and he said, "These are children who play Nintendo and Nintendo-style games, who are being brainwashed into becoming rage-controlled killers, who will kill as an adult in an adult manner, but with a childish mind. They have no comprehension of the act that they're perpetrating. It's something they are compelled to do, and Littleton is a paradigm of this problem." So I want to talk for a minute or a few minutes about these violent video games and what they've done and are doing to the minds, especially of our children. And to set the scene, we're gonna come out of the inferno, and but for a moment, I want to set the scene and give you a very, very broad strokes sense of, as an example, one of the most popular games of all time, Grand Theft Auto 5, which is supposed to be played only by 18 plus adults, but it's one of the most widely played games in the world. So in the Grand Theft Auto franchise, you play the criminal. You are the bad guy. The way that you advance plot, the way that you make money, the way you get points, and the way that you win are by killing police officers, stealing cars, running over pedestrians, murdering people, setting them on fire, selling drugs, and so on. If your health dips, you can restore it by picking up a prostitute. And after the act, you have the opportunity to beat her, get your money back, and set her on fire. Now, there's a scene in this video game, which is known as the torture scene, in which you, the criminal, are being paid by the FBI, or it's called the FIB, to torture a suspect. Now, this scene was described by a gamer on Reddit as follows. You see and hear Trevor, your character, beating, shocking, and waterboarding a Middle Eastern-looking man. He screams in pain and begs you to stop, while the FIB agent urges you to continue. The violence is brutal and shown unflinchingly, but avoids being gratuitous or leering. In the story, it is heavily implied that the torture is totally arbitrary. The man knows nothing, and the eventual assassination target is just a guy who happened to fit the profile. Trevor, again, you, are shown to be torturing because he likes it, not for the money. This serves to make the already disturbing imagery even more so, especially considering how close to reality the situation is. Now, here are two comments in response to that Reddit post by gamers, by people who play this game. The first, I felt bad through the torture scene. It was really bothering me that I had to torture someone and I didn't want to. Even though it's just a game, at that moment, I was like, oh man, I don't want to. He doesn't know anything. Stop. Another comment. Maybe I'm too desensitized by the real world, but I personally found the torture scene to be kind of over the top and comical. I read some posts about how brutal it was. Then I finally get to that part of the game and end up thinking to myself, surely that's not the part everyone was so worked up about. That was nothing. Now, this game topped $1 billion in sales in the first 3 days of its release. It broke the record as the fastest, and I think still holds the record as the fastest selling video game of all time. And it made more money in 2013 than the entire global music industry combined. Now, in general, revenue from video games rose 32% during COVID. And in 2021, it reached $214 billion in sales, just to give you a sense of what we're talking about. Also, in the United States, estimates, and I had trouble finding numbers because this is actually very hotly debated, but estimates are that anywhere from 70 to more than 90% of American children play video games. So that means anywhere from 50 to about 65 million children are playing video games. Some of them admit to spending more than 40 hours per week on these games. That's a full-time job practicing violent acts, including killing. Now, where did these games come from? The military. There's a person named Lieutenant Colonel David Grossman, who spoke at that same May 2000 event, the founding of the Commission on the New Violence, and who's continued to do very important work exposing the nature of these video games. Now, Colonel Grossman describes the fact that in World War II, only about 15% of American soldiers were willing to fire their weapons at another human being. Other soldiers would carry out acts of great bravery, they would put their lives at risk, but they refused to kill another human being. This inherent resistance to kill, that's what the military decided had to be overcome for subsequent wars. So they developed training programs to up the kill ratio of their soldiers, based on studies of the human brain, based on operant conditioning, to train the soldiers to raise and fire his or her weapon at the head with a kill shot at another person as an automatic response to a stimulus. Now, this program was successful. Starting after the Korean War, that 15% rose to 55%, and coming out of the Vietnam War, it was more than 95%. So these murder simulators, which successfully raised our soldiers' firing rate to 95%, were then mass marketed to our children in the form of point and shoot video games. In fact, Doom, the video game, computer game Doom, which was the favorite game of the Columbine High School killers, was designed by a man named John Romero, who had previously programmed the war game simulators for the British Air Force. So these games came from the military. They're raking in billions and billions of dollars for another arm of the military-industrial complex, Hollywood and Silicon Valley, which each year the video game industry spends millions of dollars in lobbying money to maintain their quote unquote freedom of speech, access to sell these things to children. Now, what do these games do to the brains, the bodies, and the minds of young people? It's not just young people, but young people are much more impressionable and I would say precious. So what do? It's been shown that the brains of children who are exposed to violent media, and most especially to playing violent video games, don't function like the brains of healthy children. The fight or flight center of the brain, the animal part, the amygdala, takes over. Now, usually, if we're confronted with a threat, our bodies go into fight or flight mode. Now, that's usually short-lived. For the gamer, this state, this kind of primal survival state, is triggered almost continuously for hours at a time. When in that state, the logical thinking, reasoning part of the brain is suppressed or just inoperable. There have been fMRI brain scans which have demonstrated this, but I think more in your face are the far too many cases where a child killed their caretaker or parent and later couldn't remember why or couldn't believe that they did it. Now, also during this intense gameplay, adrenaline and cortisol are released into the body in large quantities during gameplay because the body believes it's responding to an actual threat. It's physiologically real for the player. This has been shown to lead to highly increased aggressiveness, sleep deprivation, and along with that, increase in suicidal ideation. Now, also importantly for the addictive nature of these games, and they are highly addictive, is that dopamine is released in the brain in large quantities. Massive amounts of one of our brain's reward chemicals, you could say, are released. So when playing, the child is rewarded points in the games when they commit violent acts, when they rape, when they kill. And when they do this, the brain releases a reward, a dopamine reward. They get pleasure from this. Now, some studies have shown that the most violent games elicit a spike in dopamine, which is 300% over baseline. For comparison, that's more than what a drug addict gets when he does cocaine. More than that. Now, this heightened state cannot be maintained. The body adjusts its baseline, meaning that more and more extreme experiences, more and more extreme violence is sought, is needed to gain the same pleasure, the same reward. So these physiological effects aren't a secret. They've been studied, they're known, they were intentional. In many cases, they're what keep children hooked. They've been studied. Other studied effects of these games, I'll just mention two. One of them is known as mean world syndrome, mean world, where the child is so immersed in the world of video game or movie and other media violence, where violence is much more concentrated, that they come to believe that that's what the world is like. The world is mean, it's cruel, it's violent. And to survive, I have to be that way too. The other one I'll mention is the fallacy that justice is getting what's coming to you. So in other words, inflicting violence on other people. This is reinforced heavily in the plot lines of these games, that is just because people deserved it. Rejected by women, run them over with your car. Come across a petty criminal stealing a purse, kill him, set him on fire. That's justice. They deserved it. Now, I mention those two things because we see both of them reflected quite prominently in the profiles and manifestos of many of these young shooters, these young killers. Now, one final thing I'll say about these mass shooters who have carried out a lot of the public massacres at schools and other public places is that every single one of them has been a gamer. Every single one. And that's almost always suppressed in the news reporting. So just to kind of end this part, is that are video games the only cause? No. Bullying, a terrible home situation, poverty, social media addiction and harassment, drugs, all these other things contribute. And I'll say that set of things itself are all symptoms of this collapsing culture. But given 1, 2, or more of those conditions, and you add in a murder simulator, a training program, and immerse a child in it for hours a day, we've created a generation which is dissociated from humanity, from the real world, and which is addicted to murder for pleasure. So what do we do? What do we do? A couple of decades ago, Helga Zepp-LaRouche called for the banning of violent video games worldwide. She said that this new violence is a worldwide pandemic. And she called on her country, Germany, to ask the United Nations to establish a protocol to ban these games. And I completely agree. However, as she and Lyndon LaRouche and others recognize, that's not enough. LaRouche said, "You won't put this horror back in the box from whence it came." So at the same time, we have to choose a different culture. We have to have a renaissance. We have to choose consciously to shift our culture back to one of beauty, one which does not dehumanize mankind, but one that gives people access to and celebrates the creative potential that makes us different than animals. Now, there is an inherent goodness in people. And Helga LaRouche, in her recent document, 10 Principles of a New International Security and Development Architecture, her 10th principle, and I think the most controversial, is this: the basic assumption for the new paradigm is that man is fundamentally good and capable of infinitely perfecting the creativity of his mind and the beauty of his soul. And being the most advanced geological force in the universe, which proves that the lawfulness of the mind and that of the physical universe are in correspondence and cohesion, and that all evil is the result of a lack of development and therefore can be overcome. So the goodness of human beings, of children, is rooted in the joy of creative discovery, experiencing it, seeing others experiencing it, and applying it to be able to change the universe and make it better. One of the most joyful and efficient ways to experience that is through music, beautiful music. And I am absolutely convinced that if we could replace those dehumanizing hours consuming violent and other media, lost in social media, lost in this tomb, we could replace that with many hours singing in classical choruses, I'm convinced that we would have a chance to turn the corner. I also think, and I'll end with this, I think that we need a student movement. We need a movement of young people which says enough. We don't want to be turned into killers. We don't want to be sucked into the endless banality of social media. We don't want to be sent to war to die. We want to be creative. We want to sing. We want a movement of other young people that are going to stand for this. So I think if we had such a movement of people saying that and actively demonstrating that, I think that could be a very powerful weapon for the good.
Great. Well, thank you very much. And as I introduced Pastor Pointer from Buffalo, I just want to show something because when I was there, I guess it was October or so, we visited the top store. I just show this so people have a sense of the devastation of this horrific massacre. And also, I think you can even tell by looking at the portraits of those who were gunned down that these people were remarkable and precious, each one a leader in various ways. So the loss has been huge, and I'm not going to say more because I will allow Pastor Pointer to tell us what's happened and what's going on, some very interesting developments, and clearly we have an enormous amount of work to do. So thank you very much, Reverend Pointer, for joining us, and please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I want to first thank Megan for an incredible courage to call evil evil. So thank you so much. In Buffalo, so we are a typical Rust Belt American city, one that since at least 1977, when the first of the large steel mills literally just announced one day that it was closing, has been shades of its best stuff. In the 1970 census, Buffalo had a population of about 560,000 people, down slightly from the 1960 census, when Buffalo had a population of about 580,000. But today, Buffalo is a city whose population has continued to decline as the industrial complex that really fueled our entry into the Second World War was no longer a viable industry at the war's conclusion, primarily because for some reason we thought it was prudent to rebuild Europe, rebuild Japan, but not to pay any attention to our own industry and to our own needs for creating sustainable jobs and infrastructure for people right here in the United States. Now, I'm not saying that there was a problem with doing the Marshall Plan. Not at all. I think the Marshall Plan was necessary. I think also it was a simple matter. If nothing else, it was a matter of attempting to establish a just conclusion to the war, if there can be such a thing. So I was actually was as I look back historically, I find that I'm all for projects like the Marshall Plan. The problem for us is we we let this lead to the decline of American industrial worth. Because while we were building new industries in Europe and in Asia, we were doing nothing our own industrial might. And so consequently, by 1975, large industry in the United States had begun to fail. And so Buffalo is a result of that kind of failure, where we had 5 steel plants in 1975. We have only small specialty steel plants today. In 1975, about 200,000 Buffalonians were employed in heavy industry. The largest of the 5 steel giants that were here was Bethlehem Steel, so-called because it originated in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. But we actually had the largest of the Bethlehem plants right here, just outside of the city limits of Buffalo, in a small town that was named Lackawanna. And you might recognize that name. There's a Lackawanna River in Pennsylvania, and it's right outside of Bethlehem, and it will lead you right into Bethlehem. So in Lackawanna, Bethlehem still employed about 100,000 people on 5 shifts. And so Bethlehem Steel was the first of those plants to close, followed quickly by Republic, U.S. Steel, and a couple of more that whose memory is not as clear for me as others. But so consequently, over the course of the next 10 years, Buffalo lost about 290,000 heavy industry manufacturing jobs. And so that kind of accelerated the drain of people out of the city of Buffalo and to other places, often to the south. But what that created was a city that, like most cities after World War II, had a large exodus of citizens into its surrounding communities. We came in the United States to call those suburbs because they were not urban, but they were suburban. And then, of course, we've even got a name for rural communities. We are not honest with ourselves. We don't call them rural, which is what they are. We call them ex-urban. I haven't quite figured out what the reason is for calling them ex-urban, because where I come from, we still call it the farm. But in the United States, we use a lot of language that's clouded in subterfuge. Um, so fast forward to 2022. 20 years prior to that, around 2000, the Tops Market opens on Jefferson and Raleigh in Buffalo, um, along the main thoroughfare through what on each side of it is largely a minority and Black community. Um, Now, when I was a child growing up, there was business all the way up Jefferson Avenue. And it was often Black business, but it was a mix of businesses owned by a mix of people from different communities. And you could really literally walk up on Jefferson and buy anything you needed, like most American cities in the 1970s. Unfortunately, we divested our cities of people, creating these large urban communities that were no longer in the city, but suburban, just outside of the city. We begin that with Levitville on Long Island. And from there, Levittown, excuse me, on Long Island. And from there, we built those communities around all of our large industrial cities, particularly in the Northeast, but actually throughout the entire nation. So fast forward to 2022, and Buffalo is now a city of just under 300,000 people. There is a large, Buffalo is the third poorest large city in the United States, the second poorest for children, which means that more children live in poverty in Buffalo than only one other city in the nation. The American Communities survey from the 2020 census says that 42% of the residents of the city of Buffalo don't own any transportation, not even a bicycle. So when you factor all of those things together, the Tops market on Jefferson and Raleigh had become really the supermarket for about 40,000 people who live in the community surrounding that supermarket. Now, because you have a sense of what makes sense. And you know that 40,000 people should not be having only one place to get groceries. And I use that term because that's the term my grandmother, both my father's mother and my mother's mother, used when we would go to market. They would say things like, "We're going to make groceries." And so that meant we were going to shop for the fresh fruits and vegetables that we didn't have and weren't growing. And we would shop for fresh meat, poultry, and fish. And that would be a several hours affair. It was always on Saturday. We generally only ran into the supermarket during the week for things that we suddenly need, not for the usual things. So Saturday was grocery day. So May 14th, 2022, that is the situation in Tops and Jefferson on Buffalo. And let me get to where we're going. This is a supermarket that had been being canvassed by a young man who was not a part of this local community, but indeed who had driven here over 4.5 hours, more than 200 miles, multiple times, determining that this is where he would have his live video game and where he had been radicalized online as a white supremacist, and he had decided that he believed the the nonsensical white supremacist replacement theory, and that he would kill as many African Americans as possible. And when he came to Buffalo, he proceeded to do as much as he could do in the circumstances that he was in, beginning in the parking lot, where he killed 3 people. And the oldest victim was Mother Ruth Whitfield, whose son is a former commissioner of the Buffalo Fire Department and really one of the finest men I know. Full disclosure, he's my fraternity brother, but I know him. His mother, incredibly, never seemed to forget anyone. And whenever I would see Mrs. Whitfield, she would flash that big, beautiful smile and warmly embrace you, both with her gaze and then with her actual arms. He actually shot through a 20-year-old young Black man who was helping her to get her groceries to her car. That 20-year-old survived. Mother Whitfield did not. Mother Whitfield was one of 6 women who were murdered that day, all but one in excess of 60 years of age. So these were mothers, grandmothers, and in some cases, great-grandmothers. Roberta Drury was a young woman in the prime of her life, in her 30s, and her early 30s. So she had just begun to live. She was murdered that day also. And then 4 men were murdered that day, including former Buffalo police officer, retired, who everybody knew because he was there at that Top supermarket as security on a regular basis. And, I work in the inner city at the Jacobs School of Medicine and Biomedical Sciences. And so consequently, that TOPS is where we take our students. We teach a class called Health in the Neighborhood. It's a clinical practice of medicine class designed to teach students that disease needs a host, and that host is a human being. And in order to deal with disease, you first have to be able to deal with people. So on that fateful day, 10 people were murdered in Buffalo. 3 were catastrophically injured, 2 of which have had to date 13 surgeries each, trying to repair the damage of these weapons of mass destruction that our Congress banned previously, but now even refuses to talk about. Our response in Buffalo has been, we have decided we will love everyone. And so when the massacre happened in February at Michigan State University, we were horrified again, but it wasn't abnormal at that point because we've made these shootings normal in our American context, but not normative in the way people should live. So I want to be clear that while this has become a uniquely American experience, this is not how we should live together with each other. And not only have we raised our children in the violent society, but we have raised them and we have surrounded them with violence everywhere. So in Buffalo, we've decided that we will do just a counter of that everywhere we will surround them with love. So when Michigan State happened, the dean of our medical school was at a conference of medical school deans, and she happened to be sitting next to the dean of the medical school at Michigan State University. And she called me on a break and said, I think I want to invite them to Buffalo. Do you think it's too soon? And I said, it's never too soon to love someone. Even in the most horrific circumstance they may have known in their life in that moment. So please make the invitation, and she did. So we invited Michigan State students and faculty to come to Buffalo and to share with us so we can help them begin to better process these uniquely American occurrences and how better to deal with this. So we spent the entire day with them, just talking, just enjoying each other as brother and sister, as a group. And our pledge is that next February, when they have to remember the people who were murdered in their community, we will travel to East Lansing and we will share with them. We will be with them. It cannot be, though, that this is the only thing that we do. Megan, let me just simply tell you that the only thing that will work is not just the student movement demanding an end to this, but Megan, we need young people like you to decide that you will go to these legislators, local, state, and national, and that you will replace the anti-geniuses that are running our governments. And so I agree with you, it will take a youth movement, but I need a youth movement where youth rise up and decide to serve and then move aside the idiocy that is often found, and you'll forgive me for this characterization, but it's just absolutely true, in old white men. And if we can get young people, whoever they may be, to serve, we can arrest a whole plethora of foolishnesses that we engage in this country. Because what I know for sure, Megan, is young people your age and younger understand the horror and the abnormality of these American practices. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Pastor Pointer. So I think, Megan, Jose, I guess you'll bring us all together here on the screen. And Megan, why don't you go ahead and respond? You've got.
Yeah, I like the very diplomatic term of anti-geniuses. I think that's quite apropos. But I think what you said is really important. What you reflected, I don't know that you said it directly, but the recognition of the human goodness in the other. I mean, that's inherent. I was just thinking, I was just reading a lot of material from our LaRouche organization, for LaRouche movement from the past couple of decades on the new violence, some speeches by Helga. And then it just occurred to me how much effort is being put into creating a violent society. It's not natural. It's not natural. And, you very, I think, appropriately started with the economic conditions in Buffalo. And I was also thinking about how quickly things might change if we had a top-down policy decision to rebuild the United States as part of a new worldwide economic system and outlook. The idea that young people could be going to school and coming out of school and immediately stepping into participating in, building incredible infrastructure, being taught trades and skills with very high technology, the pride, the excitement, the discovery, and that you're doing that with someone else. And so I think just looking around at what's happening, it almost seems so dark that it could never change. What could ever change this? But I think things could actually change so quickly if we had the kind of top-down change that we've been discussing, because it's natural. This kind of human love and joy is actually natural.
Thank you. Appreciate you.
I was also really struck by your beginning with the economic situation in Buffalo, because clearly that's, in a sense, the backdrop. And these are things that people tend to take for granted, particularly if you're a younger person. Imagine you don't even know a time when one person's income could support an entire household and a vacation and health insurance and college tuition on one job, working 40 hours a week. That is something. You see how people are struggling in families now. Both parents are working, or both parents are working multiple jobs. And then you're still piling up massive amounts of credit card debt. And what kind of behavior that would drive you into, out of despair, out of frustration. And also, I think, terrible feelings of inadequacy, because the mainstream media does not admit that we are in an economic depression. They say, oh, the stock market is whatever it is. So therefore, if you're feeling that you're having a hard time, that's just you. That's not the conditions of the population as a whole. So I thought that was very important.
Well, in Buffalo, what Peyton Gendron saw was an opportunity for congregating. And that opportunity was caused largely by the divesting of wealth out of the African American community, so that there's only one supermarket in the neighborhood. When I was a child, there was a supermarket like every 3 blocks. And so now you're looking at a section of the city where there are about 40,000 people who live there. And I was counting from when I was a boy and the Bills were still playing in Buffalo. They played right up the street from where Tops is now. As a matter of fact, that old stadium has been repurposed, and we use it. It's a high school football field at this point, and a community focal point. But when I grew up in that neighborhood, there were 6 supermarkets right there within walking distance, and you could choose which one you were going to. Today, we've let corporate food giants tell us that it's not cost effective to build smaller supermarkets. So we accept them building these 120,000 square feet big boxes. And then if they don't have enough foot traffic, they can't recover the money that they've invested. So they're not interested in building those kinds of supermarkets in small landlocked communities where, a 25,000 square foot supermarket would be sufficient.
And isn't Tops closing? That Tops store, is it closing again?
No.
Or that was from before?
No.
Oh, okay.
No,
Thank goodness, because I thought
Tops is committed to Tops is a local grocer. They were owned internationally by Royal Ahold, but they were repurchased by a local family, and Tops is committed to staying. They're not going anywhere. They've since reopened the supermarket. A lot of people in this community are still so traumatized that they've never been in a new store, but the store is really improved. It's also a focal point because there are 40,000 people who live there. And believe it or not, a lot of my colleagues in the medical school go by there on their way home, and they get what they need from that Tops. And then we take our students there every semester because we want them to know what it's like when you tell people, I need you to eat healthy. You need to know what they have access to.
Very interesting. Megan, one thing that I was particularly struck about from, you think you know this, you think, oh, we've talked about violent video games. I hadn't really thought through the chemical addiction quality of it. I think that is so important and something we really have to get out to people because they say, oh, it's just your opinion. Isn't this freedom of speech? I mean, isn't this amazing? Julian Assange is sitting in prison because he exposed war crimes, right? But if you want to shut down a video game that is known to have actual physiological effects on children, you're accused of violating free speech.
Yeah, exactly. And, one thing that I think somebody I was listening to talking about this said, oh, you're for freedom of speech. Great. We have pornography that falls under freedom of speech, but we don't allow the sale of it to children, right? We have alcohol, but we don't sell it to children, right? At least it's illegal to sell to children. The idea that freedom of speech should protect the sale of these very dangerous things to children is really absurd. No, I also got very gripped just reading about some of these studies because there are so many and they're undeniable. But I think it also goes back to the fact that, in some of the darker sides of psychology, like the British Tavistock Institute and going back to Bertrand Russell and those kinds of things, some of these effects, at least in principle, were studied and known. And they're being used by the video game industry because they know it can keep kids addicted.
And their only concern is profit. I say this all the time. When we fail to value people over profit, we are really in a downward spiral. That's one of the reasons I know that it has to be young people, because young people will be able to tell corporate interests to go take a long walk on a short pier, because young people will be reelecting themselves and they won't be needing billionaires to support their election.
Well said. Do that. Our friend, actually, Jose, who is doing the AV work here for us this evening, has been challenging many congressmen, and he's actually trying to recruit 435 people in each congressional district to have a young person in each congressional district who is prepared to challenge the leadership of that district and run against them if necessary. But
he may not realize he needs 535.
There you
yes.
go.
I mean, without changing the Senate, we'll still be at the mercy of old white men.
Well, there are some good old white men. Lyndon LaRouche was one, I have to say.
Well, yeah, but I mean, but the vast majority of this current Senate,
Yeah.
I would not allow them to make decisions
No.
for the zoo here in Buffalo, let alone for the country.
Some of them have been in office so long, I wonder if they're really still alive or not, or we're just seeing mummies being shuttled around through the hallways. I had that experience with Strom Thurmond once, but
oh my goodness. Just quickly on the issue of money, profit, monetary profit, it's such we're seeing the reality of this, but it's such a fallacious idea of economic value. The idea that money is valuable, but people aren't. And we can just kill off and destroy the population, but we're still making monetary profit. That's not a sustainable situation. And we're seeing that now. The financial system's blowing apart. But the idea that we do know what to do. We do know what real physical economic profit is. You referenced the infrastructure, the heavy industry, and that's driven by the human mind. That's driven by these discoveries. And that's a successful economy.
We'd have to abandon capitalism as we know it in order to really put in place an economic system that is just, because capitalism's only aim is to put most in the hands of the owners of the means of production. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels were absolutely right about capitalism in that respect. Capitalism cannot be a just economic system because its purpose is to create surplus labor. So that means that labor costs get driven down and that the wealth of a nation gets concentrated into the hands of a few. Now, when Adam Smith wrote that, he actually believed that an oligarchy would take care of us. I don't know what he was smoking, but clearly he was delusional.
Well, it's interesting because I was just reading a paper by LaRouche called The End of Our Delusion. And he said Marx was the fellow who invented the term capitalism, which was really a tricky thing to do because it blurred. So what people are taught now is either you're a Marxist or you're a British free trade. In other words, capitalism is usually defined as buy cheap, sell dear, the invisible hand, exactly Adam Smith. The lost science was known as the American system, where Hamilton was very explicit. And I just, over Christmas this year, reread George Washington's farewell address for all the patriots. George Washington said, we need a powerful government. Why? To protect people's freedom. Why? Because you need a government that's going to rein in the billionaires. Otherwise, they take over the government, and that's exactly what you've seen. And Hamilton, many people today looking at his credit policies will say, well, isn't that socialism? Isn't that No, Hamilton, who himself saw the horrors of slavery being born in St. Kitts and Nevis, the sugar trade, where the slaves, sort of like being in the army in Bakhmut, their life expectancy was only months. The slavery of the sugar plantations in the Caribbean was so brutal. So he wrote about this as a child. He was horribly affected. He, was very affected by this. So he comes here, becomes the adjutant of George Washington, and, created a whole system of economy with a national bank to actually protect people. That was the conception of credit. Why did we pay our debt after the revolution? A lot of people said, oh, forget it. Everyone knows we had a war. You don't have to pay the debt. He said, no, we'll never have credit again. Of course, we're going to honor the debt. We're going to consolidate it under the government. And we're going to go into more debt because we need to build roads. We need to build canals. We need to increase the productive power of labor of our nation. And it's so much lost. People now have this very peculiar idea that you somehow have to let, I have this debate with people about the Federal Reserve. I say we have to get rid of the Federal Reserve and we need a national bank. And they say, no, you should just have cryptocurrency. You should have no regulation whatsoever. Well,
Lord help us.
I mean, if you have no regulation, guess what? Whoever has the most money is going to run everything. Is that really what you want?
I mean, could we really survive a handful of Elon Musk's running the nation, indeed running the earth? Are we kidding? No, what Hamilton, and see, Hamilton could never be in the United States today. And he couldn't get in because he would be coming from what 45 called a gutter country, St. Kitts and Nevis. Two, he is not from the aristocracy. And we are loath to admit that we have an aristocracy, but indeed we do. And that's why you hear the intentional, deliberate attack on the Fourth Estate out of the mouth of 45. Because, this is the process. Because you can't have a press that actually tells the truth. and that people would listen to, and they would educate themselves. And then, of course, in our American system, no one is reading any of the founding documents. No one's reading Hamilton today.
Right.
No one's reading Madison today. No one's reading any of the Federalist Papers. We're not reading Paine. We're not reading any of those founding fathers who reveled in concluding the relationship with the monarchy. And we spent the last several months sitting around biting our fingers waiting for a coronation that doesn't affect us at all.
Right, with
that even the British subjects aren't as interested in as we seem to be.
Yeah, very good point. How did that happen to us? How did we lose our way? It's even at the end of the Declaration of Independence, it says that we're not going to accept foreign titles and things like that. And we have all these like Sir Henry Kissinger and Sir this one and Sir that one, accepting knighthoods from the monarchy.
Alan Greenspan.
Oh, yes,
Yeah.
Sir Alan Greenspan.
Yeah.
Let me not forget.
Heaven forbid. So we have become really antithetical. If the founding fathers, if we could just get them all together in Philadelphia and let them survey the nation, they would plead with us to let them go back to the cemetery because they would not believe what we have allowed the nation to become. In the Federalist Papers, I think it was Federalist 26, there's a whole discussion about the citizen legislator who comes to the government for a few years, does good work, and goes home and resumes their career, their profession. And what we have is a bunch of professional legislators who spend more time on makeup and hairdo than the starlets in Hollywood's heyday.
Especially the old white men.
Yeah, because I mean, what are they going to do? But so when you look at the economic condition that we have allowed the country to deteriorate to, and this artificial crises that's been manufactured by Kevin McCarthy, singularly by Kevin McCarthy, and then you realize that he's dealing with a bunch of legislators who really need treatment for a number of social maladies that they are suffering from. They need therapeutic care and probably a team of clinicians to deal with their neuroses, psychoses, and whatever other circumstances they're suffering from. You realize that we are in perilous hands. And it's why it's so important that you open talking about the perilous condition that we find ourselves in this proxy war between Russia and Ukraine. And the Ukrainian people have been, for all intents and purposes, abandoned. And we have not the decency to be honest about that.
Yeah.
Right. Yep, exactly. No, they're just being used. And you think about there was almost a peace agreement just 2 months into the fighting, and Boris Johnson flew over there and said, don't negotiate, you just keep on fighting and we'll send you more weapons. So it's worse than it's cannon fodder. It's literally cannon fodder. And it has to stop because the illusion people may have, but you already described it with what's happened to our cities, and our cities, you're saying really even starting at the end of World War II, which is very interesting because that's Mr. LaRouche used to talk about this all the time. He said the soldiers came back from the war, they'd done things that were heroic and valiant. They came to their families and they said, look, you lost 5 years, you lost 2 years, just keep your nose clean, don't get in trouble, don't agitate, don't speak out, just try and get on with your life, go along to get along. But you look at the World War II generation compared to the generations that came after, And what you see is a kind of a degeneration, one generation more morally compromised than the next. And so we've been in this decline, but I also concur with Megan, it can reverse very quickly. If you have
for sure.
Right, I mean, you think about Kennedy saying we're going to put a man on the moon in 10 years. And while he was doing that, building all these massive infrastructure projects, starting the Peace Corps, so you have a vision, you have an idea where you're going, and that you need, people are not a burden, they're a resource, that every person has a talent to contribute to the mission. And all of a sudden, it may take 25 years to solve the infrastructure collapse, but the entire social and cultural outlook has changed.
Well, look at the radical condition that we do not find ourselves in, because it was General George Marshall who said we must rebuild. Now he was serving as Secretary of State at the time, or what we now call the Secretary of State. At the time, he was saying we can't just leave that devastation that we participated in. And he also said, and so then just a half a generation later, um, John F. Kennedy is in the White House, and he says, I'm going to create the Peace Corps because we have to help the rest of the world into this century. And we have to help them in the condition that we find them in. And if Kennedy were alive today, I dare say he would be drawn and quartered by the right, and to some degree by the radical left, because his ideas that we would be cooperative would be outrightly rejected today. And so we've become really the antithesis of ourselves. We are nothing like the nation imagined by those men who railed against the monarchy and who said, in the course of human events, and then called us to arms, and then reminded us that every now and then the tree of liberty must be refreshed with the blood of tyrants. Now that's a gory kind of picture in your mind, but you understand that they're writing metaphorically. They're not really talking about spilling blood. But what they are saying is you have to recognize who the tyrants are and dispatch them. And we fail to do that now.
That's a very good point. I really appreciate what you've said. I think it's time to wrap up, and that's a very good note to leave this on. And I would like to say, in keeping with what you said, on June 10th, the Schiller Institute will be involved in at least a virtual conference, maybe a live conference. That is the 60-year anniversary of the speech that President Kennedy gave at American University, where he, only 5 months after the Cuban Missile Crisis, said, we have to work with the Soviet Union. He said, we may find communism repugnant, but that doesn't diminish the fact that the Soviet Union lost over 20 million people in World War II. We have to learn to see the world from their perspective. And he announced his intention for the nuclear test ban treaty. And he said, people may say peace is impossible, but not so. And he challenged, and as a true leader, because that's what real leadership is, it's not pandering to the lowest common denominator of whatever you're told by your pollsters the population thinks, but by challenging the population to be better. And he was, in a sense, to use an unpleasant word, lecturing the graduating class that they should look within themselves if they were rejecting the idea of peace and reconsider how they were thinking about things. So this year is the 60-year anniversary of that. I think it's a very important standard for leadership. We're approaching presidential elections, and you had in Kennedy, John F. Kennedy, this standard embodied, and people should remember it. And I think it gives us a guidepost as perhaps to how to avert thermonuclear war, which we're headed to right now at the moment. So I'd like to thank you both so much for being with me tonight, really, both Megan and Reverend Pointer. And I think this program is going to get a lot of circulation. I'd like to encourage everyone who watched, this material is very important. Please share it all over the place. And we'll see you next week. Thank you.
Thank you.